Can you hear me now? Oh, you can very much hear me now. Indeed. Yes, indeed. So my name is Michael Hewitt, and it is great to finally be joining the class. I've been following it online throughout, and the discussions have been extraordinary. So I'm very honored to finally be a part of it. And today, it is my honor. Oh, please.
We had a problem with the recording of the last class. The recording failed for some reason. So that's why the class on Schopenhauer is not on the website.
Great. So today, it is my honor to introduce Buddhism, which is not an easy task within a mere 2 hours. But my goal will be to present some of the most challenging philosophical ideas from the Buddhist tradition. I will do so intentionally with the following goal. We will be asking ourselves how we can take these ideas seriously. Seriously in several senses of the word. Will we, the answer hopefully will be yes, but this is not easy, will we allow some of our most fundamental assumptions about the self and the world around us to be challenged by taking these ideas seriously? Will we allow some of our most fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality to be challenged? And if we do so, and hopefully again the answer will be yes, what are the implications? We will also, of course, be willing to take these ideas seriously in the next sense as well, which is, if we allow them to challenge our assumptions, are we happy with where they take us? The answer is not, we won't be. These ideas are not striving to make us happy. Nonetheless, do we like where they're taking us? Again, the answer will be no. We will not like it. If all of this is the case, what is the criterion by which we can then judge them? And as always, we will open this up for discussion. And part of taking ideas seriously is to challenge the ideas. We want the ideas to challenge us. We will challenge the ideas. And then we will continue in this discussion over the next several weeks as we try to engage with some of the most challenging philosophies from around the world. Now, to introduce today's session, let me turn back the clock by about 3,000 years. And discuss when these ideas arose, why they arose, hey, how's it going, and what they're in response to, an introduction that will also help us for next week. So when I say about 3,000 years ago, that takes us to about 1000 BCE. And let's take a quick glance across Eurasia. You might think that would be a tough thing to do, right? Radically different cultures all across Eurasia. Actually, no. That's pretty easy to do. When you look across the major settled agricultural areas of Eurasia, you see a set of societies that are actually surprisingly similar. They are called Bronze Age societies because one of the most revered metals of the time was bronze. Bronze was a very expensive metal. It's an alloy of tin and copper, very expensive to make. Important to note because it is exclusively the reserve of an aristocratic class who alone use bronze materials. They use bronze ritually. They use bronze weapons. It is an aristocratic metal available to no one else. So peasants in the fields are still in the Stone Age, using, for the most part, stone implements to plow the fields for the aristocrats. As you can tell from my opening characterization, these are radically stratified hierarchical societies dominating the landscape across Eurasia. All power, wealth, and control of all sorts are in the hands of a very, very small hereditary elite, the Bronze Age aristocratic class. From this comes, of course, the ruling class, the priestly class, and everyone is ranked below. That hierarchical ranking is based exclusively upon birth. So either you're born into one of these very few leading lineages, or you are not, in which case you are arrayed at whatever lower level you happen to be born into. There is almost no social mobility whatsoever. When we even use the word almost, we're kind of like covering ourselves. But the truth is, we found no evidence of any social mobility. These are purely ranked societies. As such, the religions of the day, not surprisingly, are equally based upon this. So the priestly class, as we've mentioned, is purely hierarchical. It's an hereditary class. And it supports a religion that is the exclusive domain of this higher aristocratic elite. These Bronze Age cultures dominated Eurasia for about 2 millennia, an extraordinary period of time. And equally extraordinary is their destruction. So we're at 1000 BCE. For something like 1700 years before that, these societies have dominated Eurasia. Over the next several centuries, every single one of them across Eurasia crumbles. There are a series of factors involved in this, all interrelated, so I'll mention them as if they're separate, but they're not at all. One of them that I'll mention immediately, because it will become the name of the next age, is the invention of iron, from which we will call this next phase to come over the first millennium BCE, the Iron Age. Now, you might think it's a little odd that we're giving so much weight to metals, but it's important because, as we've seen, bronze being an expensive metal, exclusively the domain and control of an aristocratic class, iron, on the contrary, as you know, is a natural substance that's everywhere. And the only problem, technologically speaking, with using iron is simply you need to learn how to generate enough heat to work with iron. As soon as that technology is developed, and we're not quite sure where in Eurasia it's developed, but wherever it is, it looks like it's sort of in the steppe region, maybe slightly to the western end, just because archaeologically those are our first examples, but who knows? But regardless, wherever it's first developed, it spreads across Eurasia. And this is significant for several reasons. Since it's everywhere, and since it only requires heat, once the technology is there, means it's readily available, suddenly everyone can start using iron weapons. It means peasants in the fields are no longer plowing with stone materials, they have iron plows. Suddenly, entire arenas of land that were unusable can now be used. Suddenly, agricultural yields begin dramatically increasing. Populations begin dramatically increasing. And, of course, with all of this comes other things too. Not such good things, but let's get to all of them. Once you can start having material usage of iron widely, you can also, for example, no longer have bronze weapons being run by aristocrats on chariots, again, with no one else being involved. Suddenly you can start arming mass infantry armies, all with iron weapons. And if you're going to have a massive population growth and massive agricultural yields compared to anything that's come before, as well as the possibility now of mass infantry well-armed armies, suddenly you have the beginnings of social mobility. If you have mass infantry armies, suddenly people begin being promoted because they're effective on the battlefield. If you have mass populations, it also means other things begin developing too. Significant trade routes begin developing. Cities begin developing. And with cities and trade, suddenly people start becoming wealthy too through trade. And suddenly, for the first time in about 2,000 years, this little tiny aristocratic group that had dominated everything begins to lose control. And over the next several centuries, all of these factors begin a cascading effect, wherein by about 700, 600 BCE, then you look across Eurasia, and suddenly every single one of these major kingdoms has been overthrown. Every single one of them. And it institutes a period of radical political and religious experimentation. New forms of statecraft are invented. New forms of religion are developed that I'll get to momentarily. New forms of social mobility are developed, unheard of in Eurasia now for 2,000 years. This is when, on one end of Eurasia, of course, you get the invention of it's a Greek term, but it's very different from the way we use the term, radical democracy. The term democracy, of course, is a Greek term, but this is not like what we call democracy, representative democracy or rule of law. This is radical democracy, meaning basically any established citizen can walk into an arena and vote, and the answer is whatever they vote. It's also, in the radical form in Greece, it's a slave society too. You get radical forms of democracy. You also get new and oftentimes exceedingly dangerous forms, oftentimes, if possible, more dangerous than what you saw before, of radical forms of social exploitation. In some ways, if that's possible, worse than in the Bronze Age. jumping across to the eastern end of Eurasia. Not democracy there. What you start getting, and we'll be discussing this more next week, are the invention of, indeed, very much rule-based, merit-based, massive state organizations trying to actually have rules of law that would apply to everyone. Imagine this, everyone equally, with merit-based systems in which people would be promoted on merit, not birth. Completely unheard of over the previous 2,000 years. Radical forms of political experimentation. And, of course, of most interest to our course, radical new forms of philosophical and religious movements. So radical that a figure, Karl Jaspers, about a century ago, gave a name to this period, the Axial Age, the period when these radical philosophical and religious movements began that literally transformed the major civilizations of Eurasia. One of these, of course, famously begins in Greece. This is the era of Plato, Aristotle, the Orphic movement, the Pythagorean movement, all this period. Again, the term philosophy is a Greek term, which is why we use the term, but keep in mind, this is different from the way we tend to use the term now. These are not academic philosophers. These are radical figures trying to radically re-envision the nature of humans and the types of communities we should be building. In China, we'll be discussing it in much more depth next week. This is when you get Confucius, Zhuangzi, Lao Tzu. Again, we use the term philosophy to talk about them, but keep in mind, again, not in our sense of the word. These are radical figures calling for radical new forms of social involvement in the world. And of more immediate concern for today, in India, this is when, of course, you get the emergence of Jainism, and of the most immediate concern for our discussions today, the Buddha. All of these movements, put together under the claim Axial Age movements, were attempts to radically rethink the nature of the world. They have many differences that we'll mainly be exploring, but let me just begin by mentioning a few similarities amongst them. The first is the most obvious one, but it's perhaps the most important one to begin with, so I'll emphasize it, even though it is a little obvious. All of them find the world that Eurasia had been in for the previous 2,000 years horrible. Horrible. The idea of a ranked world based upon birth was abhorrent. Now, as we've already seen in Greece, that does not mean necessarily a claim for radical equality. We'll see. That varies dramatically by area. However, the claim that some kind of ranked system where everyone would have a single position based upon birth was seen as absolutely horrible. Some means of salvation, therefore, should be potentially universally available. We'll see. Again, lots of debates as to what universal would really mean. However, some kind of a claim that it should not be controlled simply by this one aristocratic elite is common across the board in these radical Axial Age civilizations. Relatedly, another claim is that there is some form of higher something. We'll use the word higher truth, but as we'll see this week and next week, we have to expand our definition of truth to use the word. Some notion of a higher order should be guiding us, and is certainly, again, available to us, that should allow us to radically throw off the conventions into which we have been born. These are movements that are extremely oppositional to the social conventions of the age and call for a radical reevaluation of them. And therefore, they need something other than simply the social world you're born into to turn to for this radical social reevaluation. That being said, what they look for is going to be very different. One theme that already, of course, has played into our course that will become very significant in 19th and 20th century European and American thought that we've been exploring in depth will, of course, be the notion of the individual will. That the individual will is one of the bases by which we can question the social conventions into which we were born and lead to a radical reevaluation by the claim that this is not something I will accept, and humans should be allowed to impose their will upon the world as opposed to simply accepting the pre-given world into which they are born. This view has in fact become so common, we often now tend to associate it almost exclusively with liberation, right? So if you want to liberate the world, you turn to the individual will. Then all sorts of other possibilities are open to you, but we tend to take for granted that's, of course, the place by which you will seek liberation. It was not, intriguingly, the only option that plays a role in the axial age. And we're going to explore several, but today one that will strongly oppose this view. And because, again, it will so cut against many of the assumptions that have now become so key for our visions of liberation, it will challenge us, hopefully in a good way. It's very intriguing to note that claims of liberation need not be based upon notions of individual will. In fact, we'll be exploring one today that will say that, in fact, is going to ensnare us in the worst dangers we are capable of as human beings if we focus on the individual will. Agree or not, but let's try to follow what the argument is and what they are claiming. So, with that is a general introduction to the axial age period, a general introduction to this extraordinary period of religious and political efflorescence, with both the great powers that emerge from that and the dangers. We've already gotten hints of the dangers that play out in this period. But note, most of the assumptions now in the world come out of this period. Most is probably, if anything, too weak a word. And if many of the assumptions dominant in the world have really come out of one strand of one piece of that axial age movement that occurred in Greece, it's worthwhile to actually look at these others and ask if we can indeed learn from these other attempts to rethink the world. So with that as a quick introduction, let's turn to Buddhism. One of certainly the most influential, that's historically undeniable, but I would also say philosophically most powerful movements in world history. So, Buddhism. And let's begin with the Buddha. So there are many stories about the Buddha. I will tell you one. We'll come back later in the lecture toward other ways of reading the story I'm about to give you. But let me just begin with the bare outlines of the story. So the Buddha is born into an aristocratic clan. He is born into a world very much continuing the old Bronze Age world in which he, as a prince, will soon inherit a kingdom. He is born into one of the highest classes. And he is born into a world that believed everything was based upon birth, and the entire ranked classes of the world were proper because people are born into the class they deserve to be born into. Again, variations of this are pervasive throughout the Bronze Age. He begins this life, not surprisingly, in extraordinary luxury with the world at his feet, which he will soon be inheriting. He takes a wife. He has a child who will, of course, someday succeed him, so he will be king. His son will be king, and his entire future is laid out to him. And then he is taken out on trips to survey the great land that he will be controlling, the great land that will be his to rule, the great land that he can see as his domain. But as he's taken out, he begins to notice people starving on the sides. And he's told, don't worry, don't look over here, look over here. And he notices other people in horrible suffering. And he begins to ask, what's going on? And he's told, no, don't look. But he keeps going back. And he sees all of the horrors around him in the world in which everything is based upon birth, and therefore in which most of the population, almost all of the population, that he is supposedly his come-to-be kingdom, is in horrible, horrible suffering. And then he returns to the palace. And of course, quickly realizes that this world of luxury requires that world of suffering outside. And then he begins to realize he himself, of course, is suffering horribly too. But he just becomes so incredibly good at accepting the world that he was living in as natural that he failed to even see his own suffering. And so he decides to leave. He decides to leave to try to find out what is going on. He breaks out and he begins to wander, looking for different figures who can teach him higher possible worlds could exist, what higher proper visions could guide him. He begins attempting radical forms of self-emaciation to try to reach some higher truth. None of them, the other teachers, these radical forms of self-emaciation work, and he keeps seeking. And finally, at one point, he sits under a tree and begins meditating. And through the meditation, he begins to see. He ultimately achieves enlightenment and then devotes his life to bringing these teachings to the rest of the world. And let's talk about these teachings and what they really mean, and also what they really mean about the story I've just given you. So here, it turns out, is what is really going on. The world we think we live in, the world we think is perfectly natural, the world we think is simply the way things are, is, on the contrary, a creation of we humans. Now, that might immediately sound very exciting. Wow. We humans, therefore, can create the world around us. No, this is not exciting, because we don't create it that way. We don't create it by imposing our will about what is good on the world, or rather, we actually kind of do, but not in the way we tend to think of as a good way. Here's the world that we really live in. The world that we live in is actually a product of our cravings and desires and hunger. Among these things are cravings for wealth, power, status, honor to enhance ourselves, our hunger for stability in the world, our hunger for a world that is stable and clear, in which we can hopefully dominate and grow and be empowered, and which will always be there, unchanging. A world in which, yes, I will have great power and status and domination, and in which everything around me that I will grow to love will always be there, perfectly stable and supporting me. And in this, we create an illusory world. Not illusory, and this is very important to note, in the sense that you can simply pull a curtain and see the real world. No. Illusory in the sense that it really comes to exist. We create this world, but it's illusory in the sense that it is completely false, radically different from the world we think we are actually living in. Because when we do what I just mentioned, the world we create is a world that we think is working perfectly well. A world in which, by definition, I'm gaining what I want in life, in which the world around me is stable and understandable, and in which I can learn to grow it, control it, and master it. We think that's the world we're living in. This is why it's illusory. Because that world we slowly create, in fact, is a world of total, horrible suffering. And it's illusory because we are living our lives denying the horrible suffering that we are creating for ourselves and for every single human being and every single living creature in the world. That world we create is a world in which we become attached to these false, illusory things that we've created. I'll begin with some obvious examples, but then get to the more chilling ones. Here are some obvious examples. So, I become attached to my great power and status that I think I've achieved. It's illusory because as I become attached to it, number one, it will never give me the satisfaction that I foolishly think I'm attaining by it. And moreover, whatever power I think I have is only going to crumble. I become attached to those relationships that I think I've built that will last forever. In fact, those relationships I think I've built are illusory because the people I think I love are, in fact, false creations of me. I'm not seeing them for what they are. We'll get momentarily to that. What I see is what I desire. And I desire this person to be X. I fall in love with X. I think my life is good because I have X. I don't have X. And I am doomed to a world of suffering by definition for myself, and the poor person who's being defined as X is equally doomed to suffering. But it gets much worse. Much.
That's not bad.
No, this is peanuts. This is peanuts. Yeah, indeed, indeed.
Stage one,
Indeed,
stage
indeed, indeed.
Ooh, Lord have mercy. We all need some cognac pretty soon. God.
So let's get to the real suffering.
Oh, this is rich. This is rich.
So I come to realize all of my hopes and dreams that I've lived my life by are going to be destroyed, and I see them destroyed. I come to see that all the relationships I thought I had built and all the loves I think I have were false loves because I was creating things that don't really exist out of my desires, and they crumble, all of them. Now you might think, okay, how could it get worse? Because you might think, well, at least I've got myself, right? I can fall back on me, and I can be personally fulfilled and happy, even though let's put it into a little stable category. My career won't give me satisfaction. My relationships won't give me satisfaction. We'll see soon. These categories are absurd. But for a moment, like I'll claim these to be these categories, say, okay, I don't care about my career. I don't care about my relationships, but I've got me. No, you don't. This is where the real suffering comes in. Because this thing that you think is you, this thing that you think I can always look within, find my true self, be true to myself, and maybe I can't impose my will on the world in the way I thought I could, but at least I can love myself and fall back to me. That is the worst, most dangerous illusion of them all. In fact, it's really the cause of all of the other ones. Because this thing you think is you, this thing you think you just have and you can always fall back on and be true to and embrace and be authentic to and sincere to, all of that, no. That is simply a creation of your worst desires and cravings and hungers that have created this thing you think is you. And when you think, I can just love myself for who I am, what you're loving is a bunch of craving, gross desires that have created this thing that is creating unbelievable suffering to those around you, because again, you keep reading them according to your own desires, that is actually creating this entire world that you come to think of as the stable world you're living in. And all these things, we can put in our nice categories. My career, my relationships, but at least I've got me. You've got none of them. None of them. You are creating a world of suffering for yourself and every single thing around you. And now you might think, okay, at least we've hit the low end and it won't get worse. Oh. Nope. It gets worse still.
Oh, my
because you might think, okay, well, at least, bizarre this would seem as good, but at least someday that suffering for me and the horrible suffering I'm creating for those around me will come to an end because at least someday I'm going to pass away, right? And at least I won't be continuing this harm to everyone around me, and that will be the end. No, it is not. No. because the horrible suffering that you're creating that's now become this horrible self that's imposing such horror on the world around you. Again, remember, these illusory things, they're not illusory in our weak-willed sense of the term. They're illusory in this strong sense. They exist. We create them, which means when you die, it continues. And that self is simply reborn. And you play out the exact same thing, creating yet more horror for those around you in lifetime after lifetime after lifetime for all of eternity. Your lives are a result, you are creating, that's why I'm just going to put it way too mildly, you are creating an endless series of lives of suffering for yourself, for eternity, and for every poor living creature that will be affected by the horrible things you are going to be doing in the world, again, for all of eternity. That is the world we are living in. Okay. So, as you can see, it's a little bleak. So how do we get out of this? How do we break from this cycle of horrible suffering for every living creature in the world? Because as you can see, if this is continuing forever, it will affect everything. And all of living creatures become snared in these horrible webs of horrible suffering, with each creating yet more suffering for everyone else or everything else around one, and even worse, with our thinking this is a perfectly fine, nice, stable world with nice, stable selves in which we just recapitulate this for all of eternity. So the way you break this is you begin with the source. You begin with what's really creating all of this suffering. You begin with the self, and your goal is to destroy it. Or rather, much more importantly, realize it doesn't exist in any stronger sense other than that you have created it. And your goal is to break it down. Your goal is to engage in the extraordinarily difficult work of breaking down this self that is creating such horrible suffering for ultimately every living creature. And when you do things like the kind of disciplined work involved with meditation, what you're doing in meditation is you are realizing, forcing yourself to realize, and believe me, it is not a pleasant thing to realize, you are realizing as you go through yourself, you are realizing what it really is. The horrible, gross cravings and desires that have been underlying everything you've ever done. Even the things you thought were good about you, the things you love about yourself. It's cravings and desires all the way down, and you're breaking it. And the goal of this is to realize that there is no self. And when you can finally break the self, you also break the horrible cycle of suffering that you have created for yourself and those around you. And by doing so, you can finally achieve nirvana. Nirvana meaning an ability to have no cravings, no desires, no attachments, and for that exact same reason, the only possible way to have pure, compassionate, universal love for all living creatures. Not the kind of love that we think we have, which is all based on our desires, but true, universal love. Going back to our story, the Buddha achieved this. And once he achieved enlightenment, he then devoted his life to helping all living creatures to achieve enlightenment as well. a life, in other words, with absolutely no craving and desire underlying our acts, with no attachments whatsoever underlying our acts, something that's almost impossible to imagine, which is why it's such an extraordinarily difficult vision to even contemplate, less put into practice. And yet, this is the vision. So he begins teaching. And he begins drawing to himself disciples. And all of the disciples do what he did. They leave the world. They leave the world, they leave all of their attachments, they devote themselves to an extraordinary practice, not of radical self-emaciation, the Buddha tried that and it failed, but rather of the discipline of controlling the mind, controlling the desires, and ultimately breaking this self that we have created through our desires. And then they also did the next side. Like the Buddha, they then returned to the world. And this is the key, because of course, the ultimate salvation, which you can probably also already see, in implication, but it's worth putting out, the ultimate salvation would be pure annihilation, nirvana. Nirvana in which you would fully leave this world. But note, the Buddha doesn't do that, nor do his disciples, the monks, because the more difficult work is that next stage. Once you extinguish these desires, you then return to the world of suffering. And your goal is to live in the world of suffering, helping all living creatures to achieve enlightenment as well. That's the real work. That is the work of a Buddhist. Now, accepted immediately, as you can see in this, is the implication that not all humans, by far not all humans, will be able to undergo the kind of incredible level of work that it entails to accomplish this. And so the sense is always, you're working with everything around you to begin the process, right? You are training people to begin to live their lives outside of the hungers and desires and cravings that guide their lives, outside of the attachments that dominate everything they are doing. And the more you are training people to do this, the less suffering they will do, the more they can help those around them, and the more of this you can do, the more you help every living creature in the long run, because again, our actions ultimately reverberate through everything, to move closer toward enlightenment. And again, it will always be a few that will actually literally leave society and go that next stage. But the degree to which you can help all living creatures lessen the horrible suffering they're imposing on everything else is the key work you are trying to do. All of the political visions of Buddhism come out of this. So, as you can immediately see, Buddhism will not become associated with a single political doctrine by definition. It's never an ism, if you're a Buddhist, you're an X. Rather, the sense is you are training yourself to see in every situation the real suffering that's underlying everything. And you are sensing what you can do to alter that, what you can do to break that suffering and break the cycles of suffering. To break, in other words, all of the things we are doing that are ensnaring everything, truly everything, around us. And let me stick on that word cycles for a moment, because it's a very intriguing notion. We've already seen cycles in the grand sense, right? We die, we're reincarnated, recreating our horrible suffering for everything around us, life after life after life. But note it happens at a micro scale too. In this so-called stable world we think we're living in, we're living in cycles of suffering, where we repeat these same horrible acts on everything around us without us even noticing, because again, we just think that's just me. I'm just like this. I'm just the person who is X, Y, and Z. And what we're really doing is creating these cycles of suffering that we just impose on every poor creature who comes into our orbit over and over again. And those who are moving toward enlightenment become ever better at sensing situations, sensing the cycle of suffering that's underlying them, and sensing how to act in mundane situations, in grander political theaters, and ultimately in terms of every living creature. To give you an example of what this will mean in practice, you have all of these stories of Buddhist monks who will be described as figures who will simply, in situations, do little things to alter the situation. And the sense is they're sensing the cycle of suffering, and they're doing little things to break the attachments that is creating that cycle. And every little act you can do helps move all those creatures away from suffering by definition and inching them towards enlightenment. And then the grander political statements of the Buddhists are along the same line, simply at a grander level. What are the acts you can do to break cycles of oppression at a larger societal level? The things you can do, including seemingly horrible things, setting yourself on fire, but anything you can do to break a cycle of oppression, to wake people up to whatever cycle that is and shift that. And again, the much larger work is ultimately the enlightenment of everything. Now, as you can see, this is not a mild philosophical vision. This is a radical philosophical vision. And I want to emphasize that because a very domesticated form of Buddhism has become very typical in America now, and it's worthwhile to see the much more powerful vision that really is underlying this. To give you an example, in America now, you'll commonly hear things like, well, you should do meditation to learn to calm yourself down and be happier in the world. So we get stressed out when we go through the day, and if you meditate, you can calm yourself down and not be so stressed, and then you go back to work, but you won't be as stressed. This is not Buddhism. I mean, you may decide to do this, but this is not Buddhism. The goal of Buddhism is not to make you be able to live your normal life unchanged with less stress. The whole point of Buddhism is to help you, force you to radically break the world around you, radically break the suffering you're creating for those around you, and ultimately to radically break the self. You don't meditate to learn to love yourself for who you are. You meditate to break yourself and to break the horrible suffering you're inflicting on the world around you. So, this is not a religion that's about happiness and being less stressed and more calm in the world. This is a religion based upon the claim that we are living in a world of horrible oppression and suffering, and most of the visions of liberation, this was true then, but if anything, more so now, most of the visions of liberation that we think will save us from this are based upon claims of the individual will that, in fact, in the long run, are only going to make it worse. And the whole point of this teaching is to train us to see the horrible suffering underlying what we think of as a perfectly natural, stable world, a world that we are then forced to see we have in part created. And the goal of these teachings is to break that world, alter that world, and ultimately break this self that is sadly helping to create this horrible suffering around us. Yes, looking back on the Bronze Age, a Buddhist would say, yes, a world of horrible suffering created by this vision that everything is born into a particular place. But as you can see immediately, the Buddha's critique goes much farther and will say, even the places where we think we're creating liberation, be careful. Because even if the forms of oppression aren't as obvious and aren't as clear as something so obvious as, only people born into this one lineage have any possibility of salvation, that's horrible, but that's clearly horrible. What if in all the little daily mundane acts we are doing with those around us, we are often potentially inflicting incredible suffering? And the key of Buddhism is you're training yourself to see that too. And you're training your mind not to fall into the desires that are creating that horrible suffering. And you are ultimately trying to become a sort of human being who would not only see the suppression, but be able to alter the suppression and do so without any of the desires that usually guide our actions, which would mean truly doing so selflessly, truly doing so out of true compassionate love, and never doing anything that you think is good for you, because, of course, by definition, that's only going to create more suffering. It's an incredibly powerful vision, and I think you can now get a sense for why this incredibly powerful vision would become so important. It became a radical movement that would spread throughout all of Asia, one of the dominant religions beginning in India. It moves up into Central Asia, spreads into China, Japan, Korea. It then spreads through Southeast Asia and becomes one of the most dominant religions of the world, always with the sense of training people. Not only we live in a horrible world, but we are creating the horrible world, and we usually don't even see the horror we're inflicting on those around us. An extraordinary religion, and yes, I think a religion that is worth taking deeply, deeply seriously. Thank you. So let's open this up for conversation. Yes. Great. Oh, yeah, please,
Yeah,
please,
I
yes.
Can we start it?
Of course, always.
Well, first, we just want to acknowledge an extraordinary lecture.
Oh, not at all.
There's a level of clarity.
Not at all. Not at all.
Of breath. No, this is true. And it gets right at what education of Paideia is all about, which is to profoundly unsettle us. Because I don't know about you, I'm deeply unsettled. My moral parochialism and intellectual provincialism that's tied to the legacy of Athens and Jerusalem primarily, always open to other religions and insights, but it's rare when you get a full-fledged Weltanschauung that pulls the rug from under so much of what one has been resting on, if you go back to a Socrates and Amos or a Jesus, what we've been accenting in this class, and then to get it from somebody who's just such a brilliant scholar and such a wise person and a sensitive soul and gentle spirit. That's a magnificent combination, let alone here at Harvard Law. Harvard Law is not used to that kind of combination. Harvard University is not used to that kind of combination. So the first question would be the elective affinities of what we've been talking about in this class.
Yes.
With what you've laid out.
Yes.
Which is to say, the cycles of domination, oppression, exploitation
Yes.
that we've been accenting.
Yes.
The ways in which envy, resentment, hatred, contempt are shot through the souls of each and every one of us. But from the legacy of Athens and Jerusalem, when you get to the self, the end and aim is the transformation and transfiguration of a self, but still tied to desires.
Yes.
Whereas Buddhism is about dissolution or elimination of a self in which you're actually somehow getting beyond desires. Now, the first question is a paradoxical question. Is the attempt to escape from desires itself a desire?
Yep, absolutely.
If it is itself a desire, is it a different kind of desire than the desire that we're trying to gain, hold at arm's length, you see? Secondly, though, we have been accenting individuality, temporality, and historicity in this class, which is also connected to legacies of Athens and Jerusalem. Right? This sheer, what William James would call stubborn fact of being a particular organism with bodies and minds and hearts and traditions and languages thrown into space and time. And it's a stubborn fact you can't escape. Your body, this brother's body, my body, mind, heart, soul, it's here, sheer facticity. What does it really mean to try to engage in a dissolution or elimination of that self? Or is it really another version of a kind of transfigured self? Because what re-enters the world for Buddha? What is it that re-enters if the self is dissolved, if the self is eliminated? Because I like that re-entering. It's like Plato's cave. Yeah. Go back. Exactly. Down you must go. Katabion, the Greek says, right? Down you must go. Yes. Buddha, back into the world. Yes. Oh, my God. Return to this horrible, sorrowful world tied to cravings. And the only way you stop that cravings is through the spiritual meditations. So that we got this overlap on the one hand. But how do you account for that fissure, transfigured, transformed self, eliminated, dissolved self in relation to different levels of desire?
Yes, both beautiful questions. Let me deal with each in turn. So first of all, is it a desire to want to get rid of your desires? Yes. And this is actually when you're going through the process, one of the key points, because if you go, I mean, already you'll see this is an incredibly difficult process to go through, but always what you think of as the last stages is the moment when you think, yes, I'm achieving this state. I'm becoming enlightened. I've controlled my desires. I've become better than those around me because unlike those around me, I have no attachments. Putting it as you did beautifully, I'm desiring to have no desires and desiring to therefore be better than those around me because they do and I don't. And needless to say, it's one of the most dangerous traps. And then you have a teacher there to say, no, you haven't even begun. Because as you said, you're simply desiring to achieve this, which means, needless to say, you're reproducing the whole thing. It's all, look at me, look how great I am, I'm better than everyone else, look at the extraordinary things I've achieved. It's one of the most dangerous stages. And then the goal is, no, no, no. True lack of desire means true lack of desire. Indeed. And even that stage of I desire to be without desire, no, you're actually recreating and potentially at a more dangerous level because you think you're enlightened. You think you're acting on behalf of the world. You think you're being compassionate. No, it's all about yourself and your own power and your own ability to control the world. And it's, if anything, more dangerous. So yes, that's one of the single most dangerous steps. And intriguingly, that's actually related to the second question because the answer is absolutely. And so I mentioned I was going to go back to the story, and I only partially did, the story of the Buddha. Let me actually take your question to say a few more words about it. So in this story, is it simply the case that we have a human being who realized this and achieved enlightenment? From one perspective, sure. There are other ways of reading it, and which way of reading, of course, is of no relevance because each of these are possible ways to think, but there are possible ways to think that get you back to this question. So another possibility is the Buddha himself was doing this from day one for us. In other words, the Buddha had already achieved enlightenment in a previous life and had come back to do these actions as a human being in this way to help us to see the process more clearly. And the reason I put this in answer to the question is, by definition, the fact that he would be born into that body within that conventional order acting in this way was a means to help us to see the world of suffering that was created by this hierarchical society, and that person breaking from it in the way he did is a guide to us. Important because right now, a Buddha coming through would do it differently. Right, he'd have a different body. He would act differently. The forms of oppression are different. Actually, sadly, they're not as different as we'd like to think, but nonetheless, it's a different type of oppression. And the Buddha would do different things. And so whether it is literally the same Buddha coming back or different figures, different humans achieving enlightenment, again, of no relevance. But what is of relevance is your key question. At any moment, what it would mean to act in the world and alter it is always going to be historically based. It is right now, in this situation, what do I do? At this historical moment, what do I do? The forms of oppression, to bring it more to immediately to our concerns, the forms of oppression operating right now in the US are radically different from the forms of oppression operating in say, the north of India at the time when the Buddha is operating. And so what you do, how you would act, how you would try to shift that world would be radically different. In a sense, it was almost easier when you're living in a world of just everyone is born into a stratified society to say, that's bad. But part of the danger of America, as we've been discussing in this course, is we think we live in a liberated society. No, we don't. We live in an incredibly dangerous society, creating incredible suffering that, again, is, if anything, more masked. And so therefore, getting back to the heart of your question, a figure of enlightenment would do different things. It would be literally a different body, acting in a different way, shifting that in a different way still. It's a great question. Yes. Yes.
Michael, let me also just continue Cornell's line of questioning by posing three questions that might be among the first questions asked from the standpoint of the history of Western thought.
Yes, yes.
So one is a metaphysical question. The second is a question of moral psychology. And the third is a question of sociology and politics. So the metaphysical question is whether it matters that the view of ultimate reality on which these ideas rely is true or not. So there are two interpretations of Buddhism, I suppose, metaphysically. One is that it relies on a particular metaphysic, and the second is that it relies on no metaphysic at all. And it is a practical therapeutic conception that is, as it were, metaphysically neutral. Now, let's consider each of those two possibilities. So if we think of it as relying on a metaphysical conception, we might situate it in relation to three metaphysical options that we've discussed in this course. So one option is the classical Greek philosophy of being, continued in the tradition of modern science. There is an abiding structure of ultimate constituents of the world, types of being, and regularities or laws governing these constituents. And this abiding structure and the laws are outside of time. And they are more real precisely because they are atemporal. Now, then there's a second view, which is the view of monism, of speculative monism, often associated with Buddhism and other philosophies of ancient India, and by Buddhists themselves, not by the original Buddha, but later in the history of Buddhism. And that view says that all the distinctions among beings and among selves are superficial and ultimately illusory. There is only one ultimate reality. Suffering arises from clinging to the false distinctions of this realm of shadows, of appearances. And therefore, time itself is ultimately an illusion. There is only this one timeless reality. Then there's the third position, which might be thought to be the most powerful, but that in fact speaks with the weakest voice in the world history of philosophy. The third view is that everything changes sooner or later, including change itself, that everything that is real is mutable, and does not become less real by virtue of being mutable. So in other words, we then dissociate reality from timelessness. We think that the real is temporal and historical, and that's the real world. And in that view, time and history are fateful, and they are the scene or the setting on which we ascend or fall. One interpretation metaphysically is that Buddhism is somehow tied to the second of those three options. And then an objection to Buddhism metaphysically is that that view is false, that view of ultimate reality. The true view is the third view. So the dispute includes a dispute about the facts of the matter. Now, there's a second interpretation of Buddhism, which is that it has nothing to do with a metaphysical conception. As is said in one of the traditions of Buddhism, it's not a conception, it's a medicine. And it is, as I suggested before, metaphysically neutral. But it's not clear that we can escape from the problem of the facts of the matter in this way, because our view of what medicine to take and of how medicine works presumably depends on what the world is like and what we are like within the world. So then the facts of the matter count. And according to this argument of before, the Buddhist conception seems to rely on a wrong understanding of the facts of the matter. And we can't resolve the issue by treating it simply as a therapeutic. Now I come to the question of moral psychology. So, in your own account of Buddhism, you emphasize a central element of agency. So there's a questioning of the reality and the continuity of the self. Paradoxically, at the same time, an idea of the super hardness of the self, because insofar as we fail to break down the self may persist across lifetimes. So we either destroy it or it survives death. But the objective, as you said, is to break it down. And the way to break it down is to undermine all our attachments to other people and all our engagements or projects in the world, because they are the chains that tie us to this world of illusion and suffering. Now, we think in the dominant tradition of Western thought that the experience of agency is inseparable from our connections and from our engagements, our projects, that's how we enhance our agency, by connecting to other people, by trying to change the world, by failing in trying to change the world, and then by nevertheless changing ourselves in the course of these transformative crusades. And that's our characteristic Western idea of agency. It's not clear what the alternative to that idea of agency is. And it seems from a Western perspective that this Buddhist conception of agency, as you describe it, is paradoxical or contradictory. We abdicate our connections and attachments, but somehow preserve and even enhance our agency. And the question is, on what basis do we do that? We have in the West a conception of the foundation of the enhancement of agency. What's the alternative to that conception? That's not clear. And it's not clear as a matter of moral psychology. And in a sense, it leads back to the earlier metaphysical question. Now, finally, then, there's the third issue, which is the sociological or political issue. So the teaching is the teaching of renunciation, of the renunciation of connections and attachments. And it is most readily embodied in the figure of the Buddha, the Bodhisattva, the monk who live apart from society, or have a very special role within society. But what about the society? The society, although condemned or redescribed as an illusion, doesn't vanish as if it were a fantasy. It continues to exist. It has its economic life, it has its divisions, it has its hierarchies, it has its division of labor. Do we regard it as an eternal profanation, a mistake? Or how do we relate the form of life prescribed by this doctrine to the real existence of a real society? If we're not able to do that, except in some fossilized theocratic doctrine that puts society under the rule of the monks, then our doctrine turns into simply a kind of redescription of the social world, rather than the basis for a reorganization of it. A license to escape rather than a license to transform. And the redemptive activity, rather than being social and political, becomes simply individual. These three questions are obviously connected. The metaphysical, the moral psychological, and the social or political.
Yes. And great questions. I'm actually going to answer them slightly out of order, beginning with number 2, then number 3, and then turning to number 1, the metaphysical.
Yeah.
So beginning with the personal and then moving to the political, a slight disagreement. So I would say beginning with the personal side, not really, and therefore strongly so with the political side, no.
By the personal, you mean what I call moral psychology.
Yeah, what you mean by moral psychology. And let me begin there. So the key with the moral psychology is, and your word was, you take away the possibility for engagement in the world, and therefore the agency involved in that. The slight disagreement is you're absolutely rejecting the form of agency we, for example, tend to take absolutely for granted, but you're actually not denying engagement in the world. And this is one of the intriguing things about the tradition. It's actually, and it goes back to your very first question, Cornell, as well, it's actually a form of, ironically, selfishness were we to achieve a state of enlightenment and then not be involved in the world. That's selfish, which again is one of the worst forms from this vision of what we can be as human beings, because you're leaving the world of suffering.
Understood.
You're not trying to help.
But what's then the basis of agency?
Yes, and so then the return and engagement in the world is, the argument would be, can you, and their answer is yes, not to imply it's easy, can you be engaged in breaking the suffering around you without any of the fallback to our cravings and desires that underlie our ego? Because the vision is, if it's based on that, what we would call agency, then you're not really ending the suffering at all. In the long run, you're simply doing things to enhance yourself. And true engagement would mean an engagement without our vision of what real agency is. Now, note immediately, you're still engaged, and therefore, you can, if we use the term very, very broadly, there's agency, but not in any of the ways that we tend to use that term. Now, I begin there to turn to the third point, key, but again, here, given the slight disagreement in the first point, it'll be a stronger disagreement with the third. It does mean, and again, the tradition shows you this very clearly historically, very strong engagement in the world. I mean, a Buddhist monk who simply withdraws and stays there and doesn't reemerge is seen as selfish. I mean, that's selfishness. I mean, the easy thing to do is, as horribly difficult as this discipline is, it's still too easy to simply stop. The whole point of this is you then return. And then you have to engage in the world outside of your own ego. And again, we mentioned the mundane examples, but keep in mind also extremely strong political examples. But your engagements are sensing the complexities of the cycles of suffering we create for ourselves and sensing what to do to begin to break them. And historically, that will mean all sorts of radically different things, which, again, can never be given under a simple ism. It's not that Buddhists tend to be X, Y, or Z. In fact, by definition, if they were breaking their own philosophy. By definition, what you will do in a certain moment or in a larger political circumstance is going to be radically different. But it's absolutely based upon engagement. Now, that brings us back to the first question, the metaphysics. I'm not quite comfortable with any of the three categories for Buddhism that you mentioned, and the reason is all of the points you mentioned would be posed in a negative way. And what I mean by that is the following. So the way it will be put is to say, when we perceive the world to be stable in all the ways that we do so, and let me just give some standard examples. So an obvious one would be the one you mentioned in the first metaphysical possibility. There is a stable world out there with clear natural laws that explain how actions occur. No. Absolutely incredibly dangerous. There's a stable world out there that we can analyze in terms of clear concepts that will direct our actions. No. There is a world out there with clear dualisms that will tell us how to behave. No. As you can tell from the examples, the point is clear, but let me make it explicit. Any attempt by us to see a stable world governed by stable laws with stable categories will always be implicitly, and in ways that we won't be able to see, part and parcel of this incredibly dangerous world of oppression that we are unknowingly part and parcel of creating. And so when you're breaking those down, the claim isn't metaphysically, it really is a world of absolute flux. That position comes out of the negation, right? It's the negation of the stable world that we are seeing around us would be, in practice, therefore the implication would be, a world of constant flux. But again, they're not going to assert that because, of course, it's the same notion of illusion we were getting at before. It is right now a stable world, right? Like it isn't really, it's just that we've created that. But illusory is real. Like we have created a world that is a stable world of oppression in which these cycles of oppression will continue generation after generation after generation. And so the move is always a negative one. So getting back to the examples you've given in the tradition when metaphysical statements are being given, remember, those aren't positive assertions. It's breaking our attempts to give a stable statement about the world, about anything around us. And so even claims about oneness, about flux, you make those to break our foolish attempts to see a world of stable natural laws, stable societal divisions, stable selves, stable categories. The goal is always to break those. So returning then to the other part of the second question that I didn't quite get to, but now let me make more full. So I wouldn't call this therapeutic in that limited sense, because yes, I mean, it's changing everything, but the danger of a word like therapeutic is it sounds like, again, I'm trying to ease my personal suffering, which is, again, the American variant of this that I think is kind of dangerous, where it's all about me becoming...
Could be therapeutic for the suffering of others.
Okay, but it's suffering for everything, right? Like
yes.
the larger point is we have created a world of suffering for all living creatures. We're part and parcel of having done that, and we're breaking from that. So I worry therapeutic may sound, it feels like too minor a word for the project, and the project is really saying the entire world.
I just got it from one of these classical texts in the translations that say this is not a conception, it's a medicine. That's what they say.
Well,
and
yes.
so it's of course not the only strand within Buddhism, but it does appear to be one of the strands.
But use medicine in a much stronger sense, right? It's you are trying ultimately to break all forms of oppression that underlie everything. So again, as long as you're using medicine in a strong sense, fine, but the danger is in an American context, again, we need to be careful to avoid, I know you weren't saying this, but we need to avoid a sense that it's medicine in the sense of, I'll make myself more calm by doing meditation. I mean, that's not the sense. It's you're breaking the world around you.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
So we open it up.
Let's open it up, absolutely.
Just
Tons of
right
questions,
here.
please, yes.
So, 2 points. First, is there any distinction in these teachings between the classes of the time? Because are they, is he blaming everybody for the suffering? Is everybody's part the same? The aristocrats, the people who are actually physically suffering? And second, about the purpose, part of the purpose, which is universal law, without any particular attachments to particular people.
Yeah.
But I would say that maybe sacrificial law requires particular attachments, not to particular people, but to humanity itself. Otherwise, it's impossible.
Mm-hmm.
What about that?
Yeah, both wonderful questions. And let me begin with the first. Ironically, yes. And so clearly, I mean, the aristocrats in charge are most to blame. But part of the power of this is to say, look, if 90% of the population are living in servitude and are continuing this generation after generation for, by this point, 2 millennia, we're all part and parcel of allowing this to continue. So yes, I mean, those in power deserve more blame, but we're allowing it to continue. And so we are part and parcel of that world of suffering. If I'm not doing anything to change that world, then that means this other 89.99999% other than me of the people suffering, I'm part and parcel of that because I'm allowing it to continue. So the answer is yes. Now, well, yeah, no, definitely. But of course, the reason that's so important is that next step, which is to say we all, therefore, both have the ability, but also, therefore, the responsibility to try to break this world. Like if you say all the blame is on that top 1% alone, then they need to change. Well, they're not going to change. like if we don't do this, even if we're among the most obviously oppressed, but if we don't do the work of changing, they certainly aren't going to do the work of changing. So the reason they're so committed to saying we're all part and parcel of these webs is that's how you also give the responsibility to us as well, because we've been waiting for 2 millennia for them, right? Right? And so that's the key sense. Now, the second point, beautifully put, and yes and no, and this is part of the power of the tradition. So yes, in the sense, if we use the word sacrificial love as you did in your very last sentence, then I would say yes, because it's an absolute sacrificial love for all living creatures. But, and this is part of the terrifying power of the tradition, that absolute sacrificial love for all living creatures means it's universally compassionate. And yes, and that's the key. So if we say, but it's through my love of X, Y, and Z that I will achieve these higher things, beware, because probably your love of X, Y, and Z is precisely what might be preventing you from really seeing all that we could be doing. So it's a radical sacrificial love. Yes.
It encompasses the particular people, but it's not restricted to them. And maybe
Yes.
that kind of love requires a sacrifice of particular people or your attachment to them.
Precisely.
Because you
Yes.
choose humanity, you choose the people themselves,
Yes.
and not yourself or your relationships to your family.
Yes. Yeah, beautifully put. I think that's beautifully put. Absolutely. Yep, beautifully put. Great, thank you. Oh, no, you choose. You choose. Absolutely.
In your great lecture, I think it was really enjoyable. You used a number of terms, and then also in Professor Unger's feedback to a questions, there's these terms that are being used of desire and agency and
Yes.
will. And I guess my question is sort of, how can we reappraise those terms, which
Yeah.
seem to be predicated of, you keep saying this is challenging a very fundamental assumption.
Yes.
So desire, will,
Yeah.
it's all predicated on a subject that has those things. And then
Yes.
Buddhism is completely ripping that apart. So how can we sort of think of desire and will? And is it really, when we say, well, it's paradoxical, desire takes you to the end of desire, is it really a desire in the way we normally think of, given the view of no self? And then thinking along that way experientially, it also seems that maybe desire, whatever it is, in this view with no self, desire sort of there the whole time, and then maybe
Yes.
desire doesn't get extinguished, it sort of gets consummated in a sense, and that in the world of illusion, desire, whether it's a self-desire, is doing all these things that aren't working, and it's getting refined and refined and refined. So I don't know, could you answer how
Yeah,
do you think
beautifully
of these
put,
terms
yeah.
of desire and will, given this view of no self and the metaphysics or lack thereof?
Yeah.
What is the relationship?
It's a variation of the question of agency.
Precisely, yeah, precisely. So beautifully put. And so, yeah, let's indeed take apart a few of these more words in more detail, because, yeah, I think that's a beautiful question that cuts to the heart of this. So the argument would be underlying virtually everything we do, everything is really, and I'll use the word desire because it's a translation of the Sanskrit term, but let me expand what they really mean by it. It's really a closer sense would be kind of the what we would think of as the most gross sides of our emotional cravings and cravings and hungers. But even that's kind of too weak a word slightly. So let me just give you some very concrete examples. So underlying everything we do, imagine, is really vicious resentment and jealousy and hatred and horrible levels of discrimination underlying potentially everything we're doing. And the reason we don't see this is because we actually see this as simply part and parcel of the way the world really is. So they want to use the word desire in this strong sense of these horrible sides of ourselves that we mistakenly think, oh, I know, jealousy, resentfulness, and hatred is bad, so I should control that and focus on my good sides. They want to say, imagine, but they want to say it's the case, what we think of as our good sides are really based in that too. And so they mean desires in this incredibly strong sense. And then what we would call the self and the will and the ego and the mind, all of these are so based in these desires. And again, as you can see, this kind of very strong sense of the term, that when we think we are acting as a self with our own will, we are really simply acting out of these horrible sides of ourselves. And the reason they want to put it so strongly is they want to take out this ability that we tend to fall into to say, I'll control my negative sides. No, we won't. Then, to get to the heart of the question, if that's the case, then they want to say, that's why you're focusing on the eradication. Because the eradication would truly mean the ability to truly, truly love every living creature. Now, back to the question, would that mean a fulfillment of our desires? Only if, and as you can see, we then radically shift the definition of that term. So true radical love would not, of course, be based upon desires in the sense that gets us into this mess. It would mean an ability to truly love and relate to absolutely everything. And because we'd be able to do that, to see the horrible webs of oppression that are controlling every living creature. And by doing that, acting in a ways that would begin the process of breaking
That
it.
raises just quickly. Just
Exactly.
Bring it back to Brother Unger's point. One is it the case that all desires are reducible to base desires? Don't human beings have desires that transcend envy, resentment, hatred, contempt? That's one. That's a matter of the facts.
Indeed.
Because it might be that it's just not true.
So Cornell,
But my second point, because I got
no. But let me say something on that first point, just to exemplify what you're saying before you go to the second point.
Yeah.
So
forget about it, but
keep it in mind.
No,
keep it in
don't
mind.
forget about it. So an observation of people who study children, of child development, is that an infant only begins to be capable of sympathy or empathy when the infant is no longer actively distressed by the distress of others. So according to this view, there are two stages in this evolution. One is when the prospect of distress triggers a parallel experience in the infant. And sympathy is not distress, but this sentiment of a detached, a relatively detached empathy or sympathy. Now that would be an example of what you're saying, because that would suggest that among our primordial desires is this one, which does not result from a breakdown of the self, but results from the normal evolution of the self in society, and is in that sense a challenge to the Buddhist view as it's been described by Michael Puett.
I'm not sure, but before I respond, let's get to number two. Before you
but
forget.
That's a fair interpretation. But my second question had to do with this notion of universal love. I think universal love is a dangerous thing because it can be used and deployed. This is what Nietzsche and others have taught us, right? It can be used and deployed in ways that hide and conceal some very ugly things.
Yeah.
So, for example, the notion of my having a deep attachment to a Michael Brown and Ferguson, right? So a willingness to go down, a willingness to fight, a willingness to take a bullet, that's still not in any way equivalent to attachment that I have to my mother. And I'm not going to give up Mom for Michael. So when somebody tells me, well, you want to have a universal love for these other folk, and therefore you have to be distant from or less attached to Mom, I'm going to say, kiss my so-and-so. I'm not going there. But then by the time you get to a garden variety raccoon, or a wolf, or a cow, or a tiger, or a lion, universal love of sentient beings versus Mom. Now, this is not reductive absurdum. This is a matter of universal love can take on such a promiscuous form that it evacuates and renders empty what love is all about. You see? So that the lived experience of love, given our finite and fallible beings that we are, is part and parcel of who first loved us, who showed us what love was, what gave us a sense concretely of what constitutes love, even as we talk about my love for. It could be a peasant in Mexico, it could be for a Jew in Russia, it could be for a Palestinian in Gaza, or whatever it is. Yes, I love them all, but not like mom. Nowhere near like mom. Why not both and account for the evolutionary understanding of love that talks about solidarity, but also understands the specificity of what attachment is rather than push against attachment. Now, we know in the biblical scripture, in the New Testament, Jesus says similar things.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
He's wrong as two left shoes. In the name of Jesus, Jesus is wrong. But he was speaking metaphorically. You have to be able to conceive of yourself, but he's not asking you to somehow no longer be attached to mom and dad. He's saying you have to be able to love me in this way. But he's not asking that as a precondition for being a disciple, because that cuts against moral psychology too. Is that fair or is that unfair, you think?
Yeah, no, it's a great set of questions. And as a little foreshadowing of where we're going next week, we will see yet another variation of this, where we'll be discussing Confucians who will later be dealing with Buddhism, and one of their critiques will be exactly this. And they'll actually use very similar examples. They will say, no, the way this works is you begin with your family, your close relationships. That's where you develop your ability to truly love and relate to those around you. And it's a process of, and I'll use the word of Mencius, of extension, like you're extending from that outward. And if you move too quickly to a universal claim, the danger is you're not really developing the ability to actually relate to those around you because you're too quickly moving from what are really the key relationships from which you move. But that's a foreshadowing. We'll discuss that in much more detail next week. But let me use this moment, however, to defend the position at hand. Because again, we want to deal with it in its full complexity. Now, the Buddhist response to that, which is very telling, is they will say, well, but beware, because it's equally the case that when we talk about beginning with the love of our family and the close ones, the truth is a lot of our dangerous abilities to be oppressive and accept oppression and not see oppression, it begins with the family, it begins with our relationships, and if you're extending that's creating the world we're living in. And so the Buddhist critique would be to say, yes, like you have to start there with the detachment, because that's where most of our abilities to create horror in the world really begin, which is sad to say, but I think we can't deny it's true.
You can acknowledge that truth without detachment.
Can you? And it goes back to your first question, too, because when you're saying, can we distinguish bad desires and good desires, in the abstract, but of course they would say, beware. Because, of course, jealousy, envy, resentment, of course, those are bad. And when I say, but desire for a true love, that's good, but of course they would say, beware, because isn't this desire for a true love, to give an obvious example, am I really just desiring to meet someone just right for me, which means I read someone else in all the flux of what they really are as being this perfect match for me, which means I'm not really relating to them at all. And I think that's a great desire, right? Because it's based upon my love for another human being. What if I'm not really relating to them at all? I'm just in love with an image of myself, which is the last thing in the world I need, to put it mildly. And I've created this thing, and it creates this horrible relationship that's going to be devastating to that poor person, not to mention me, but more importantly, this poor person.
You can't reduce that other to somebody who's just a projection of your desire.
Indeed.
But you've got a right to say, I'm not looking for a person who's bad for me.
Oh, absolutely.
I'm looking for a person who's good for me.
But the key,
but the understanding of who that person is not reducible simply to a manipulation of
that's
your
the
desires.
Key. That's the key.
They have an otherness that you got to come to terms with.
And that's the
even
key.
as they got something else that you can't live without.
That's the key.
Oh,
but the key is exactly that. It's you're training yourself to see the possibility that what I think of as my good desires are really playing out my worst. And that's the key. That's the key.
I know we got a question.
Indeed. Lots of questions, please. Yes.
Speak up so we can all hear them.
I have two questions, sorry. The first is, presuming that one already has roots from your father, from where do you derive the moral imperative to return back to the
Yes.
Sounds axiomatic, like it just
Absolutely. Good question.
Anything that's created by mankind, bad by proxy, is creating itself something that can only result in bad things.
Yes.
Sort of harking back to Armin's question.
Yes.
Is there some natural order that is preferable to whatever we might create?
Yeah. Both great questions. And actually, I'll begin with the first because it leads directly to the second one. So the answer is a strong yes. And the reason they'll put it that way is they want to say, and I think there's something to this, that what really is directing our action in the world are, again, these gross sides of ourselves that are directing them. And if you could really break these, then you would realize simply leaving them would be an escape and would be, in fact, not better helping those around you, but in fact would allow them to continue their endless suffering. So they want to say, yes, yes, yes. Were you achieve this state, you would also realize that the ultimate act of selfishness would then be to stay withdrawn.
So you don't have a choice.
Yeah, in a sense, you really don't. Like by this act of detachment, they would want to say it leads to universal love. Yes, like if you could really detach, you would truly be able to love everything. And if you truly love everything, you wouldn't withdraw. You would want to save everything from the horrible suffering that you now could not help but see all over the place. Yes. And that leads directly to the second question, too. So directly related, the answer, again, would be a very strong yes. And so part and parcel of this is the sense that not, again, they're not asserting a metaphysical view. It's the negative view. The world that exists, because, again, we have created it, is a world of oppression. And were you to act in pure love of everything, you would be breaking these cycles of oppression. And they, therefore, and it's part and parcel of the philosophy, they have to do this, they will refuse to give us the easy out of telling us what that world would relate to. And the reason I think they're committed to this is if we do that, it will give us too easy a vision of what we should do, which would almost, I'll take out almost, which would by definition recreate our attempts to simply impose our will upon the world. So it's too easy to say, if we created X type of society, it would be better. No, no, no. You have to sense the complexities of the forms of oppression and sense how to act to break those. And there will never be an easy ideology telling you what that would be. It's a great questions. Thank you. Oh, yeah, you should be in charge.
So we got this sister who's going to get a woman, and then we go right back.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I have a question back to kind of the metaphysics
Yes.
of Buddhism, which I find so interesting.
Yes.
I have two questions. Something that's always puzzled me is that if there's no self, and the self is completely created,
Yes.
and there's also no soul, as in like the Christian sense
Yep.
of soul, then what is being reborn?
Yes.
You know, what is that thing that is being reborn?
Yes.
It's always puzzled me in Buddhism. I
Yeah.
never hear it.
Yes.
And the second is, so I
Yep.
understand that we, through our minds and our actions, we create this world of suffering that we perpetuate. What existed before, and did anything exist before?
Yeah.
Like, when did it start with, or were we always there creating this world of suffering? Was it eternal suffering all the way back, or was there something there before we as human beings created this world of suffering?
Yes. Both great questions. Let me again begin with the first. It will lead directly to the second. So what is it that is reborn? And so the answer is the following. When we begin creating these forms of suffering, part and parcel of that is we are envisioning a world of stability that, again, we therefore in part create. And we therefore create these stable relations, which are, again, always horrible forms of oppression and suffering that we're creating. That's what's being reborn. And so the sense is we create this stable self based upon desires, in this, again, horrible sense of the word. That is reborn, but again, what they really mean by that is when that is reborn, what's being reborn is all of these stable forms of relation that are so oppressive. So, one of their examples they'll give very frequently is when you look historically, forms of oppression weirdly can go on for generations, centuries, millennia. I mean, what in the world could create that? And their point was, that's exactly what happens, right? It is endlessly recreating. Once you've created the stable world, and people then live their lives according to the stable world, including ourselves, that will endlessly be replicated. Yeah, please, jump in.
It's your desires that are
Yeah.
Intentions are being
Exactly. That's perfectly put. It's in a very literal, strong sense of the word. It's your desires that are being reborn and all that comes from that. That's exactly right. Then that leads directly to the second question. Please go.
And is the practical structure of society, its institutional structure, being reproduced just because of that? Or is there an independent history of society?
Oh, yes. So it's, and I'm looking for good words in English to put it. So think of our individual desires and relationships that are built out of that as creating these reverberations. So, and the accumulation of all of that is what creates not just society, but the entire global world. So if you look at things like climate change, Buddhists would say, well, of course. I mean, it's not even just a human society. Everything is affected within these webs. Now, getting back to the heart of your question, once these webs are created, which of course set in immediately, that entire thing will just be endlessly replicated because our desires for a stable world assume that world to be natural, and so it, in that sense, will continue forever. Now, it requires us for it to continue forever, so if we didn't continue to live our lives in the same way, that world would be changed, but minus the work we would do, we don't change our lives, and therefore it continues. So the political institutions and all of the larger ways we've domesticated the world, the danger is they will simply continue. Yes. Now, that actually still gets back to your second question. What preceded all of this? We have no idea, right? And that's key. Like, we honestly don't know. And the reason that's important to the tradition is if they allowed themselves the easy response that some traditions do, like the golden age was X, and therefore we have to recreate a golden age, it gives you an easy X to work for, which almost by definition, going back to the earlier question too, will create a very, very dangerous vision of where you're going, and therefore leads you to not really see all the complexities of the world around you and what really needs to be done. So they don't give you an easy golden age, in other words, what came before this, or by definition, the flip side, what comes after this. We live in a world of oppression, and our job is to begin to break it.
But we saw Marcuse say all utopian thought is based on a remembrance of plenitude. So if you have no remembrance of a moment that was different than what's at the horrible world that you have, how do you generate utopian possibilities? Can an anti-utopian sensibility sustain a resistance, which is the interruption of these dominations and interruptions of these hatreds?
Well,
that's one of the roles of the Garden of Eden and the Christian story and the Hebrew and the Muslim story. You got at least a remembrance of, or you're going to find in time and space, maybe in your music, in your relationship, some remembrance of something that's outside of the domination and the hatred that allows you to know it can be real. There's a foretaste of the freedom that you're fighting for. If there's no foretaste at all, no remembrance at all, why not just be resigned? Why not just surrender yourself to a status quo? I mean, that's what Marcuse.
Oh, absolutely. But of course, a Buddhist response would be to say, you can find that without positing a golden age, which can be dangerous. You can find that in any moment. And to go back to the early example I mentioned, that would say, in any moment, an enlightened figure would just sense a little thing to do to shift that moment, to begin to break the structures of oppression. Now, the reason I mentioned that in answer to the question is, at that moment, every single creature involved, which reverberating would be literally everything, would sense that shift, right? Would sense that shift when suddenly, for that brief moment, things are actually relating. And as not relating out of in this web of oppression, but really relating. And that sense, you can feel it at any moment. That's where it comes. And so you don't therefore necessarily need a golden age or utopia. You find that utopian moment imminent in the moment, which gives you the possibility for real change. Yes.
Thank you. Two comments and two questions. If I may.
Oh, I don't know. We got 4 moments for this.
Right.
1-1. 1-1. 1-1.
The first takes me back to about 15 years ago when I asked the head monk of the monastery, isn't the desire to be-desireless a desire, and what is the use? And he said, it is like a pole vault. The vaulter needs the pole to rise, but the vaulter must let go of the pole to cross.
Beautiful image.
So he talked about it in that
Beautiful
way.
image. Beautiful,
And
beautiful.
so therefore, it is fundamental. In fact,
Yeah.
it is the only, coming back to my colleague's question about the sense of duty and how selfish it might be to gain enlightenment in the wake of all of the others that are suffering. Emancipation for one equals the emancipation of all
Yeah.
in the philosophy that we are. And therefore, the only duty of man or woman is to gain or is to try and escape this cycle of birth and death. So that is your only duty in this world. Is the but I am dismayed because the quest of Siddharthas to attain enlightenment is not new. It had existed in the Indian subcontinent and that part of the world
Absolutely.
for millennia before even Siddhartha was born.
Yes.
I wonder that his particular understanding and coming to terms of nirvana or realization
Yeah.
lent itself to a political force that resulted in the formation of Buddhism because these figures in Hindu thought, these great sages and saints that have attained enlightenment are like the Buddha in a galaxy of stars like him. But the fact that oppression was the order of the day,
Yeah.
and he became some sort of a figure to break out of the Brahminical oppression that
Yes.
existed in that political movement, however
Yeah.
devoid of Hinduism that might have been.
Mhm.
Can you speak to that a little
Yeah.
bit? Because these are not new thoughts.
Oh,
that the Buddha
absolutely.
spawned.
Absolutely. Yeah, beautifully put. And even the Buddhist tradition will agree. And so here's one version that the Buddhist tradition will say very much in agreement with this. They will say one way of reading the story of the Buddha wasn't, again, that he was simply a human being who achieved enlightenment at a certain moment. He was rather a figure who would come back repeatedly, and they actually would point to numerous figures throughout not just Indian, but all of human history who had been doing this. And from that way of reading it, the reason the Buddha took the particular form he did and acted in the particular way he did and created the particular set of disciplinary codes that he did was because at that moment, that was the way to break the Brahminical social hierarchy that needed to be broken. And other figures had been doing this and breaking other things in different ways. And the reason that's so important to the tradition is to say, and who knows in the world to come, or in the world, for example, we're living in right now, what it will take. But the reason that's important is to say, if we simply say, this one figure did it all perfectly forever, we miss one of the key points, which is, no, no, no. It actually requires radically different things at all the times. And if you're really taking these ideas seriously, as you said, it's been happening long before the Buddha and desperately needs to happen long after the Buddha, because what will need to be done will always be radically different in different situations. So yeah, beautifully put.
We've got
Yes.
two more questions. We've got our dear sister here, our dear brother in the back here. Go back.
So based on what you just said and the whole idea of everything being in constant flux.
Louder, please, louder.
So based on what you
Yeah.
just said and the idea of everything being in constant flux, like there can't be a single stable system. Isn't it kind of contradictory to still have a Buddhism today that people are following in a very traditional manner? Because like if there are always these new individuals coming in, changing up the system, then isn't in a way Buddhism no longer, at least like
Yeah.
traditional Buddhism, no longer relevant?
Yeah. Beautifully put. And let me agree with you with this very specific example. So I mentioned before that the kind of domesticated form of Buddhism that's come into America, which involves all about just sort of doing meditation to be more calm and not being as stressed, and therefore continuing on with your life unchanged in a less stressful form. So needless to say, that's dangerous for the reasons I mentioned. It's equally dangerous for the reason that you brought up here too, beautifully, because part and parcel of the wording of that is Buddhism. And we've been using this term because it's a nice way in English to sort of express a religious view, but it's a tellingly dangerous way, because exactly as you said, once we take these teachings and make them into an ism, I mean, it becomes like any other ism, right? Capitalism, fascism, socialism, communism, all of which are based upon a stable view of the self, a totalizing view of what the ideal social and political order should be based upon that stable view of the self, and an attempt to create that world by getting rid of everything else. Needless to say, Buddhism, to now hopefully put that word in scare quotes, would oppose every single one of those stages. And so any attempt, when we even use the term Buddhism, if that makes us create this into, as the word literally implies, an ism in the sense of a totalizing vision of what really is the self and what would be the proper order, which I fear American Buddhism has kind of made it into, as soon as we do that, we have lost the most basic teachings. Because Buddhism, to use the word again in scare quotes, is absolutely opposed to such a view. So yeah, beautifully put. I think that it's very important to remember we're using a term Buddhism, but that's a very dangerous characterization of it. So yeah, thank you.
That's fair. One last question.
Thank you so much for the great history and the lecture. As a Marxist Buddhist, I find this debate very fascinating. I don't know, I've read a lot of Pamela Chudron's books, The American Buddhist Nun, and that's really shaped my word outlook. I don't know if folks are familiar with her. And I don't know if she highlights slightly different, takes a slightly more gentle approach, especially to the self. I mean, we're talking about the main root of the suffering is the not coming to terms with the state of groundlessness that we're in.
Yeah.
And the main challenge is to move closer to the places that scare us, and the dark places, and the pain,
Right.
and the jealousy, but we're doing it very compassionately
Yes.
with ourselves, and not bathing in self-emaciating suffering.
Absolutely.
But becoming, I still think some of the examples we discussed are a little abstract and virtually impossible for anyone, let's say enlightenment for us to
Yeah.
reach, but in the practical sense talks about if I get jealous that my partner is flirting with somebody or someone's attacked me, not spitting out into my habitual rage, my habitual patterns, but being able to sit with it, become curious with it, and practice that over and over again, and not to engage in that habitual pattern that's going to cause more harm.
Yes.
But she always talks about being very gentle with yourself, empathetic, compassionate. So I don't know if we conflate destroying self with destroying our self-centered ego, right? If that's more what we're getting at, but anyways.
Yeah, no, I think that's beautifully put. And so, like, one of the reasons in the story of the Buddha that it begins, in his quest, I mean, it begins with him attempting radical forms of self-emaciation. So he just starves himself, and the idea is just, I'll destroy myself. And that doesn't work. And the reason that's so important, I think, is what you're getting at so powerfully here, which is to say, that's in a weird way too easy, right? Like it's if I simply just destroy myself, I won't feed myself, I'll just, like that sounds like, boy, that would really be hard discipline. Weirdly, no, that's too easy. The real work of breaking the self is exactly the way you mentioned. It's imagine a situation where, and I'll stick with your example, it's a beautiful one. So you're in a set of relationships, your partner, friends, you're training yourself to sense the degrees to which the ways you're interacting are horribly affecting those around you when, and precisely this is the key, while you're telling yourself you're acting well. And that little bit of training to see how horribly you're treating everyone around you, that's a key part of this training process. And by beginning there, you continue to work. And yes, simple radical self-emaciation, you're starving yourself, that's not breaking the self in the Buddha sense. Breaking the self in the Buddha sense is exactly the work you're talking about. So yeah, thank you.
One last question.
I want to ask, if there is no conception of the self, how does the Buddha remember his past life?
Yes, great question. And the answer is, if the Buddha, so there are various versions of this, but if the Buddha has been repeatedly coming back, then what the Buddha is remembering is that action that he has intentionally been willing to take on because he wants to avoid the arguably most selfish act of simply leaving, which he would be able to do as an enlightened figure. And so he knowingly comes back. And yet, because he's knowingly coming back, he is coming back as an act of compassion and not simply coming back to repeat the same patterns. So he remembers his acts of compassion, but that's why he's coming back. Whereas, of course, the implication of that is the rest of us, we simply come back, both in our lives, but even at a most mundane level within this current form of our lives, simply repeating the same things over and over and over again with no compassion underlying them. Yeah, follow up, please, yes.
Is it right to say that it was his acts of compassion? Like, was it truly him?
No, good, beautifully put. The answer is no. So at once, therefore, we take these ideas seriously, it's a beautiful way of putting it. So no, he's not really a him. Like he takes the form of the Buddha in order to give us an understanding of what we need to do. Yes. And
is that the contradiction that sits at the center of this Buddhist Weltanschauung?
yes. In a good way,
him
I
or
would
her,
say.
there's no individual, no individuality, no self, no personality, and yet the language that we use presupposes these.
Well, and again, because it's this intriguing notion of illusory, because that world does exist. We've created it.
We have to end, but
And we'll end there.
we're going to end. I'm going to end by telling you a little story regarding your question of the doctrine of the self.
There you go.
It's a question about Avicenna, the great Islamic philosopher in the Middle Ages.
Oh, yeah.
So a disciple of Avicenna came to him and said, Master, what do you think of this Buddhist doctrine that there's no continuous self? Avicenna remained silent, said nothing. And then the disciple protested, Master, why are you silent? Avicenna then answered, I answer only the person who asked me the question.
See you next week.
Oh, brother, you ain't strong. Oh, man.
Have mercy.
And then Unger comes in. This was a hell of a session.
Very.
This was fun, man. We got some good teaching. It was incredible. It's just the level of comprehensive discussion, zero in on the religion, complexity, the variety of voices, and yet still being true to each voice, each strain in the tradition. But you're able to just zip right in and open it up like, but you can see the quality of it.
Amazing discussion. Amazing discussion.
See you next week, though, man.
Not wait.
Oh, I'm telling you, this is rich, brother. Unger, see you tomorrow. See you tomorrow. And I'll start off with that, and then we can move into kind of connecting exceptionalism with the problematic challenges, or the challenges to the problematic program. Yeah, but that's it. We'll talk at lunch about it. No, because we've got 5. It's just 4 incomplete.
I mean, after next week, 4. But it's still a lot of time. So, according to the syllabus, what we would do is we would address each of the problematic the reorganization of the economy, the reorganization of education, and the reorganization of democracy. We should do that. But we anticipate
But we'll just build a little bit on where we left on that exceptionalism. Absolutely. See you, bitch. How you doing, my dear sister?
Good.